Good evening, everyone. These next couple of videos will take a deeper dive into the alchemical treatise known as the Turba Philosophorum. I was familiar with the work's existence, and one day I acquired the A.E. Waite edition and had it sitting on my shelf unopened for years. Meanwhile, I had read the seminal articles that sought to analyze the structure of the work in its entirety and to come up with a framework for understanding its layout as well as its origins. While relegating this work to the lower portion of my ever-expanding and daunting reading list, I continued pursuing other areas of interest, with the Turba falling further and further away in my field of attention. Until one day, I came across a brief paragraph in Algis Uzdavinis' posthumously published work entitled Sufism and Ancient Wisdom, a book that seeks to identify the connections between the Pharaonic, Babylonian, and Mesopotamian traditions with ancient Judaic thought, as well as its influence in Neoplatonism and Islam, specifically Sufism. The paragraph mentions the Mesopotamian myth of the flood, with the precursor to Noah, Utnapishti, and his ark, understood as a theurgic vessel for the initiate to build and ascend to the noetic realm. The correspondence of the dimensions of the ark and the number of dictums in the Arabic Turba Philosophorum made me pause and begin to frantically search for similar connections to verify my hunch. This led me to investigate further into numerological understanding of the first 9 dictums by the 9 philosophers and to draw parallels with ancient Egyptian mythology and cosmology. Overall, it fits surprisingly well. This video essay is dense, and so I thought it best to split it into 2 logical halves, the cosmological philosophical and the alchemical. The latter half will not explore all the intricacies of the conversations of the alchemists, since that would require a full academic textbook, and would also be frankly impossible to fully explain. But for now, I hope this may lead us a bit deeper into the alchemical knowledge of the ancients. Take care for now. The Turba Philosophorum is one of the oldest alchemical texts that has been handed down and preserved in Europe for the study and practice of the ancient royal art, alchemy. There are 3 different versions of the Turba Philosophorum, also known in English as the Gathering or Assembly of the Sages. It has been dated from around the 9th century AD, and Julius Ruska in the 1930s determined that the Turba was composed in Latin, but in actuality is a translation of a much older and now fragmented Arabic version. The one translated by famous scholar of the occult A.E. Waite is the only one currently available in the English language. It is considered the 3rd Pythagorean conference, and it is suspected that works we currently possess are part of a much more extensive body of writings. The famous Arabic alchemist Muhammad ibn Umayl, known in Latin as Senior, composed his alchemical works around this period. His works, like the Hal ar-Rumus, which have been brilliantly analyzed by Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz and Theodor Abt, reference other famous alchemists such as Zosimos, Maria, Morianis, and Hermes. The Greco-Egyptian alchemical and magical practices are very much a part of the Egyptian cultural intellectual milieu from which these Arabic writings emerged. One of the most famous alchemists, Zosimos, hailed from Akhmim, Egypt, which in Greek was known as Panopolis, a great epicenter for alchemical learning and a synthesizing of various cultural intellectual currents of thought. It has been suspected that Uthman ibn Suwaid of Akhmim may have been the originator of the Turba Philosophorum, as he composed a similar sounding work entitled The Book of the Assembly, where he records the sayings and opinions of the Greek philosophers. This compilation and comparison of sayings by famous philosophers is known as doxographic literature, and the study of it is known as doxography. Like many alchemical texts, obscurantism and purposeful veiling from the ignorant and envious is used to cover over the esoteric teachings, which, if left in the wrong hands, would corrupt the operator and allow them to wield terrible and unsanctioned power, or even to profane the sacredness of the divine work. There is still much that is mysterious about this work, and there is ongoing academic quarrels with regard to various meanings and interpretations of the text and its provenance. Although, surprisingly, not much has been definitively concluded, and many investigations have been fragmentary since Plesner's fundamental article of 1954. In fact, as Dr. Justin Sledge describes in his YouTube channel Esoterica, there still remains work to be done with regard to translating a new English scholarly edition of the Turba. I would like to build on what is known about the work and then proceed onwards with my own interpretation from a symbological and mythological dimension, hopefully contributing something of value to the discussion, or at least opening an avenue of potential exploration for future research. As I was researching the interconnections between various periods of history and theology, it all seemed to fit nicely into place. Perhaps delusory ramblings, or perhaps there may be something to this analysis. I have not encountered any academic literature to date that has explicitly drawn these conclusions and made these connections. The Turba Philosophorum is divided into 72 dictums between philosophers and alchemists, who are interjecting and elaborating on their theories and applications for alchemy as well as cosmology. A body of older texts are also frequently referred to, like those of Zosimus. Each philosopher presents a brief speech expounding on their own view and contributes a piece to the discussion. As it proceeds from one speech to the next, the knowledge builds, and some things are refined as we move toward a teleological endpoint, the final conclusions which are announced by Xenocrates. The first 9 speeches by each of the philosophers pertain to cosmological events. What makes this a particularly interesting text is that it combines this cosmology with alchemical teachings. The alchemical teachings take up the remaining 63 dictums and include a number of other speakers, with some of the pre-socratic philosophers chipping in here and there. Plesner, in his seminal article entitled The Place of the Turba Philosophorum in the Development of Alchemy, noted that the first 9 dictums were from various pre-Socratic philosophers. Each of the Greek philosophers' names are distorted from how we'd recognize them today. The text is written in Latin, and if translated back into Arabic, it is easier to decipher the original Greek names. It is an attempt to place Greek alchemy into the Arabic language and adapt it to Islamic science. In order of their appearance, they are as follows: Ximidrus, Anaximander, Euximudrus, Ixundrus, Anaximenes, Anaxagoras, Anaxagoras, Pandulphus, Empedocles, Aristoteles, Archelaus, Lucas, Leucippus, Leucastor, Ecphantus, Pythagoras, Pythagoras, and Xenophanes, Xenophanes. Although in the Turba, some philosophers are expounding on theories that other philosophers have subscribed to, or expounding on as cosmological doctrines that are somewhat cherry-picked with regard to their own oeuvre, the first 9 dictums are still a remarkably valuable source for a historian on the doxographic literature regarding the thought of the difficult-to-understand pre-Socratics. Although it is expected that Empedocles and Anaximander are included, it is rather surprising that other notables, like Parmenides and Heraclitus, are not included in this discussion. It is possible that the author or compiler did not know of these other pre-Socratic philosophers who would have contributed quite usefully to the discussion at hand, particularly Parmenides and his notion of the oneness of being, but my conjecture is that there is a significant symbological and numerological understanding to the 9 philosophers. But first, one thing must be made clear. The first 9 dictums from the pre-Socratic philosophers speak of cosmology. The first philosopher, Anaximander, discusses what is known as the non-limited, the aperon. Then Anaximenes introduces the first element, that being air, into the discussion. Anaxagoras continues with his 2 primary principles of pietas and ratio. Empedocles, who is considered the first philosopher to introduce the concept of the 4 rhizomes or elemental roots, is here discussing the double function of air as a separating element that mediates between water and earth and water and fire. And he does this through the analogy of what appears to be the Orphic cosmic egg. As Ibn Umayl declares in his Dictymia, quote, air is the life of everything, and, quote, the son of wisdom is born in the air. Archelaus discusses earth and describes the element fire as the finest and most rarefied of elements that rule the universe. Leucippus, the notion of non-corporeality entering the world, Pythagoras speaking of the simultaneity of the 4 elements while apportioning each one according to the level of being, whether angelic being or human being or bestial and vegetative beings. Finally, the arguments are polished and built upon one another, expanding upwards, as if in an anagogic ascent, to result finally in Xenophanes' final three conclusions, which is that 1. That God is the creator, and as this is an Arabic work, Allah is the creator. 2. The world is unified into above and below. 3. The doctrine of the four elements exists in both the above and the below. What we are observing here is a cosmological movement that is simultaneously evoking the creation of the universe as it seeks to describe its genesis. The symbological understanding of the number 9, or in Greek, the Ennead, is described in a work entitled The Theology of Arithmetic, attributed to the Neoplatonist Iamblichus, but is likely the product of Nicomachus of Gerasa. One of the attributes of the Ennead, composed of 3 triads, is that it is, quote, the furthest limit of number, and, quote, that which brings completion. The decad, which corresponds to the number 10, is of course the entirety of the cosmos, the all. But there is that moment by which if you've arrived at the decad, you've already brought all things to fulfillment. And in a sense, the decad, as the completion of number, is also simultaneously the beginning or origin of number. So let us remain with the Ennead. The Ennead was also symbolically used by the ancient Egyptians as the number of their neteru, or gods. This parallel is not unreasonable to make, as Algis Ustavinis states, quote, behind the Greek obsession of geometry, which Thales is said to have brought from Egypt, stand the Egyptian methods of measurement, along with the mystical theory of forms and numbers, which grounds the use of geometry in the demiurgic cosmogony, repeated after the annual flood, when the primordial hall, the noetic, quote, stone of light, emerges from the waters of. In a way, this philosophical discussion is mirroring the creation story of the Egyptian gods and the emergence of the Ennead. Anaximander begins the discussion on the non-limited, or the aperon, also known as the indefinite nature. This could have its reflection in the Egyptian primordial waters of Nun, similar to the Neoplatonic one, a state of undifferentiation before the theophany of divine forces. Air is next introduced in our text, and once again the parallel of Egyptian cosmology is striking. Shu is the son of Atum, who represents the noetic life and spirit of Atum, and emerges from Nun as the breath, or Numa. Shu's sister, Tefnut, also emerges, and as Ustavinis states, she, quote, stands for the archetypal intelligence, order, truth, and justice, the right measure for the life's emanation. This has very interesting echoes of Anaxagoras' introduction of the two principles, which include ratio, or measure/reason, but also in this medieval period as, quote, proportion. Together, Atum, Shu, and Tefnut represent the first triad of the Ennead, and this surprisingly corresponds to the first 3 dictum of the Turba in the cosmological discussion engaged in by the philosophers. Let us follow the schema and see where it leads. As we move along in the 3rd dictum, Anaxagoras is speaking of the comparative densities of the 4 elements, earth being the heaviest, and fire being the most subtle and rarefied, air and water acting as intermediate elements. This separation of fire, of a pure, let's say, celestial nature, and the density and compactness of earth seem to correspond to the separation of Nut, the goddess of the sky, and Geb, who represents the god of the earth and the divine body in Egyptian cosmology. At this point, in the 4th dictum, Pandolphus, or Empedocles, speaks of the double function of air in separating water from earth and separating water from fire. He speaks of the egg, the Orphic cosmological egg, which Phanes emerges from and subsequently separates the 2 halves, thus creating the sky and the earth. Empedocles, however, speaks of the separation of the shell from the albumen, and then the layer between albumen and the fiery yolk. In each instance, there is the presence of air that mediates each layer. Empedocles introduces 2 out of the 4 elements, water and air. A.E. Waite's page note claims, quote, the shell is likened to the earth, cold and dry, named copper, iron, tin, lead. The white of the egg is divine water, water of the sea. The yolk is sulfur, mercury. The shell is likened to the skin which covers the seed being equivalent to the egg. The white and yolk are the flesh, and the watery part is the breath or air. It is important to realize that the name Orpheus is a translation of the Egyptian title Hereditary Prince, which was allocated to Geb, who acts as a harmonizer of nature with the vital psychic principles of the Assyrian underworld. In his act of metaphysical creation, he is also associated with the goose that lays the cosmogonic egg, a common animal found in alchemical tracts. The next 4 gods contain some substitutions and inconsistencies in the Egyptian pantheon, but they are generally accepted as Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys, completing the Ennead. In the coffin text of the Middle Kingdom, we have the following words spoken by Atum, which seems to translate to our philosophical dictums on natural cosmology in a mythic lens. O you 8 infinite ones, an infinite number of infinite ones, who encircle the sky with your arms, who draw together the sky and horizon of Geb, Shu who has given you birth out of the flood, out of the waters, out of Tenemu, out of the darkness, that he might allot you to Geb and Nut, while Shu is eternal recurrence and Tefnut is eternal sameness. I am the Ba of Shu, who is at the great flood, who goes up to the skies he wishes, who goes down to the earth as his heart decides. Come in excitement to greet the God in me. I am Shu, child of Atum. My clothing is the air of life. Then said Atum, my living daughter is Tefnut. She will exist with her brother Shu. Life is his identity. Order is her identity. I shall live with my twins, my fledglings, with me in their midst. One of them at my back, one of them in my belly. It is my son who shall live, he whom I begot in my identity. For he has learned how to enliven the one in the egg, in the respective womb, as mankind that emerged from my eye. The eye that I sent forth when I was alone with the waters, in inertness, not finding a place in which I could stand or sit, before Heliopolis had been founded, in which I could exist, before the lotus has been tied together, on which I could sit. Let us pause here and take breath, gather some of our thoughts and feelings, and make room for some silence before we carry on our analysis in the next video.